St. Augustine, Florida, the state's greatest tourist attraction, or is it really a complete nightmare of a town?
Yes, just a mayor.
You got my number, though. Thank you, man. Have a great day, man. The oldest settlement in the United States. After the new national park rule prohibiting commercial recording in national parks, I kind of stopped doing videos in St. Augustine, Florida as a whole because there's many national monuments here and it just wasn't worth the hassle for me debating whether my recording was legal or not. Thankfully, that horrible law was recently overturned and it's no longer an issue, and that's why we're back in St. Augustine recording. If you're an OG to my YouTube channel, you may remember I got in trouble with the Federal Aviation Administration and they wanted to fine me $40,000 for recording something the way I wasn't supposed to. So I just wasn't going to take the risk of recording in St. Augustine and then ending up with a legal hurdle over it. But now that the National Parks rule is gone, welcome back to St. Augustine on our YouTube channel. Easily one of the greatest tourist attractions in the United States. This is a real authentic place with real authentic history. The state of Florida is jam-packed with artificial fake vacationing locations, places that endemically don't have any real value, places like the Orlando area where there's nothing historic, nothing of any real value. Now the city of St. Augustine, despite being in the state of Florida, is on the scale of European destinations when it comes to historical importance. After all, it is the oldest established settlement that exists today in the United States. And with the current anti-Hispanic sentiment that's prevalent in the state of Florida right now, a location like this that predates any English settlement by over 175 years is definitely a topic of interest. But there's even more to St. Augustine's history than meets the eye. It isn't just the fact that the Spaniards were here hundreds of years before the European English. It's the fact that the Spaniards also were doing a few things back then that kind of contradict American history books. As you guys may know, I am fanatical about studying Florida's history. I went from elementary to high school in the state of Florida. Now back then, the education system really put emphasis on the state's Hispanic heritage and history, something that the newer generations in Florida are deprived of. It used to be that when you entered the state of Florida, the Welcome to Florida sign was actually in Spanish. Who remembers Bienvenidos a la Florida? The state of Louisiana as well, with the French, would welcome you to Louisiana in French, not English. But of course, today political agendas have kind of watered down the importance of Florida's Spanish heritage when it comes to education, so of course the newer generation doesn't have this knowledge. There's no denying that the Spanish conquistadors were kind of brutes, and the history books that we learn in Florida definitely depicted them as so. But there's a few aspects of how the Spanish dealt with people that perhaps was overlooked in those history books that we read here in Florida growing up. The establishment of slavery in the United States was still in full blossom in the mid-1800s. But did you know that hundreds of years preceding that, already here in the United States, there were other European nations that were already treating Africans as freed men? Of course, none of the history books in the United States are going to teach you that, but on today's video, I'm going to give you guys a history lesson that is often overlooked. That is because here in St. Augustine, Florida, there were free Africans in a time when slavery was still in full effect in the United States under the rulership of the Spaniards, who did not look at their African counterparts as slaves. Now, it is true that the Spaniards had slaves in the Caribbean island and in much of the Latin American empire, but in the state of Florida, things were a little different. It was a well-established contingency that today marks the St. Mary's River just to the north of St. Augustine, marking the boundary between the state of Georgia, English, and the state of Florida, Spanish. On the Florida side, there were free Africans during the time of slavery, and they actually had their community here in St. Augustine, Florida. This contingency was demonstrated with wars between the Spanish and the English along the St. Mary's River, because here in Florida, The African runaways were free among the Spaniards and they had their own community. However, just north of the St. Mary's River, the establishment of slavery was strong. And in fact, it wasn't until after the Spanish influence left Florida that slavery was actually able to take full effect in the state, with plantations now as far south as Palmetto, Florida, just south of the Tampa Bay area. Eventually, after the demise of the Spanish control in Florida, slavery would spread throughout the state. Before the United States was the United States that we understand today, the Spanish and the English fought a battle over the legitimacy of freedom of Africans in the United States, the New World. And it came down to the fact that the Spanish were going to protect those freed slaves from being captive and taken back to the English. The English looked at these people as their own property, and the Spanish decided that they were not going to let the English come and take people from their communities. Doesn't that sound somewhat similar to what's going on in the United States today? Now, we're here today to talk about history, not politics. When Florida finally fell in the hands of the English, soon to become the United States, 7 ships left St. Augustine, Florida, and among those ships were free Africans, free runaways from the United States that headed with the Spanish to the island of Cuba. So finally, when the Spanish leave Florida, they take with them their free Africans to Cuba. Thus, the descendancy of native Floridians, Africans, and Spaniards left on 7 boats to Havana, Cuba, leaving behind the state of Florida to fall to the English hands. But even as most of Florida now technically belonged to the English, it was until the 1930s that the last Spanish gave up the ranches of fishing along the coast of southwest Florida. Most of the state's southern half was still unoccupiable swamps, full of alligators and mosquitoes, and land that wasn't fertile or useful for anything other than perhaps cattle. Much of Florida was still vastly untouched by the English, despite technically belonging to them. The Cubans and the fishermen of Spanish descent never really stopped going to South Florida temporarily throughout the year, chasing the mullet. It would have been fairly difficult to convince somebody in that time period to leave the comfort of the state of Virginia, where people were living very comfortable life, to go to the state of Florida to be in a hot, humid swamp, except for this particular region in the northeast corner of Florida that still had somewhat better access to the rest of the United States via coastline, and of course, weather-wise, much more comfortable. Thus, St. Augustine continued to be a fairly well-established city, even in its early stages of the state when everything else kind of wasn't there for Florida. With Henry Flagler's efforts to bring the railroads to Florida, this area also, after the demise of the Spanish, continued to have a considerable English influence, visible in much of the architecture that still exists today. In other words, the city of St. Augustine has a strong English and Spanish heritage. And in a state like Florida, devoid of any real historical places, the city of St. Augustine really is somewhat of a unicorn of a destination for travelers. And it's one of those destinations that attracts a lot of Latin American tourists. You'll notice that while in the city, a lot of people from Latin America vacation here to see this destination that is of important historical value to Spanish people, not just English. Making St. Augustine kind of one of the most unique historical places in the United States is that it attracts people not just of the United States and English speakers, but it's also very important historically for people of Spanish descent. Its beautiful and historic streets are filled with tourists almost throughout the entirety of the year. St. Augustine is different in that consistently it attracts tourists. For example, we were just in Jacksonville Beach. North Florida beaches are popular during the summer months with southern tourists. And then, of course, in South Florida, you have the snowbirds during the winter. But St. Augustine is kind of a good for all seasons type of travel destination, a place you can go to year round because it isn't the weather that makes this place attractive, it's its importance historically. Close to large cities like Jacksonville, Daytona, and Orlando, it is still practical to go here. And its historic and beautiful cobblestone streets are walked on by tourists throughout the entirety of the year, making this an evergreen travel destination for Florida, where the vibes are always good and people are always here. In a state as seasonal as Florida is, and as different as the southern part of the state is to the northern part of the state, to where even the busy times of the years are different, a place like St. Augustine gets a comfortable balance of both. It can enjoy the snowbirds during the winter, and it can enjoy people trying to enjoy the beaches in the summer, making this, again, geographically kind of a unique place that can take advantage of tourists throughout the entirety of the year. And while there are sites of incredible historical value throughout the entirety of the city, namely among them the Castillo de San Marcos, built by the Spaniards, very similar to the ones in Havana, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, there are still quite a few tourist traps as well. And unfortunately, not everything is authentic and real about St. Augustine. There are definitely some tourist trap things going on here, making day-to-day life for the people in this city almost impractical, if not impossible, by the hordes of tourists and, of course, attractions that make a somewhat nice historical place also feel somewhat like a historical Disneyland. But with as bad as tourism has been in Florida over the last year, I think the locals here have more to be thankful for than complain about when it comes to the small inconveniences that exist and moving around a city that everybody wants to see. Located in St. Johns County, this is also one of the safest and fastest growing regions of the state. And while much of the state is now suffering, St. Johns County in a lot of ways continues to grow, particularly the northern part of the county adjacent to Jacksonville, Florida. But then comes all of the unfortunate southern historical racist issues that seem to be plaguing this area for decades, if not centuries. For example, it is not a secret that much of the growth around St. Johns County has to do with white flight from Jacksonville, Florida. An issue that persists to this day are the racial tensions between Hispanics, whites, and blacks in this area, something that even shapes the growth and development of these cities in Florida. Now, the northeast corner of Florida likely has the most racial tensions, and I think a lot of it has less to do with history and more to do with current situations than anything. You may recall a while back a Guatemalan tourist was staying at a hotel. He wasn't here working illegally. He had his papers. He was a real life tourist that was vacationing here to enjoy the city, where a St. John's Sheriff's Office officer attacked him needlessly without reason, without probable cause, without a call or complaint. He just decided that he wanted to bother this Guatemalan. The police officer got into an altercation with the person who was ignoring him, as he should have. He was a paying guest at the hotel. Long story short, the police officer has a heart attack and dies, and the St. Johns County Sheriff's Office pressed homicide charges on the Guatemalan tourist for the death of their officer. The Sheriff's Office also made a press conference where they stood behind their officer. Well, it turns out that surveillance footage did exist, both from body cam and cameras, that confirmed that the officer had no probable cause, reason, or complaint to be bothering this person, and was most likely engaging in what we call as, well, I can't really say this on YouTube, but there's a particular word for hitting a robbery on somebody who's undocumented, and this officer probably was just trying to extort this person, leading to his own freaking death. A completely unnecessary death of a police officer engaging in community activities that were unrequested, unnecessary, unwarranted, and probably even suspicious of some type of extortion. Despite the fact that evidence would eventually come out defending this person from this wrongful accusation of hurting a police officer, the agency still stood behind their police officer, even though preliminarily they knew what happened. They just wanted to cover for him, bringing up an interesting question of relationships with racism in the state of Florida, in St. Johns County, being among some of the worst in the state. It isn't a secret that Hispanics and African Americans in this community have tensions with law enforcement, who many times justifies wrongful behaviors. There wouldn't be enough time on today's video to elaborate on all of the social issues that affect people coming here, but it's well established that the St. Johns County Sheriff's Office is definitely one that people are afraid of. In fact, in my travels through the United States, We've been in 35 states, and this is one of the few places I've ever been pulled over in, proving that police profiling here is still a thing. During the time of COVID, we were doing some videos in Jacksonville, and we went to St. Augustine, and I got pulled over for what I would describe as being white in a black neighborhood. And this type of police patrolling exists everywhere in the Deep South, but leave it to Florida to be one of the few places where I've actually got pulled over. Now, of course, we've been all over the United States. What are the chances I get pulled over in St. Augustine, Florida, out of all places? It's really undeniable that in this part of the state, racial tensions are an issue to this day. Could you argue that I just happened to get pulled over in St. Augustine, Florida? Sure, but we've been all over the United States. Why did it happen here? Although we really know the deal with the story of the Guatemalan, everybody saw that body cam footage, and most people knew what time it was when that video came out. It's not a secret. Like I said, even the growth and development in this metropolitan area spans from white flight. As beautiful and historic as this city is, it's better fitted as a tourist attraction than a full-time place to live. Great of a tourist attraction as it is, full-time life here really is inconvenient at best. Traffic, never-ending crowds as well. And then you also have to deal with the politics of racism in this area, which are noticeable for some people, meaning that this area doesn't feel welcoming to everybody, despite the irony of its heritage being Hispanic and African American as well. A lot of people forget the importance of African American history here. Just like the English and the Spanish presence left their mark on this area, you can't forget that many of the international tensions that were involved in the history of this place came down to one thing. What would be the future of enslaved runaway people that ended up as free men living in St. Augustine, Florida, in a community with the Spaniards? And keep in mind that historically the Spaniards committed atrocities in the state of Florida, just like they did in the Caribbean, and slavery was just as cruel in the Caribbean as it was in the southern part of the United States. A lot of people forget that little detail, that the slavery cruelty isn't just a historical stamp of the United States, it's actually prevalent all around the Americas, and there were slaves in the Caribbean and Latin America and Brazil, just like there were here in the United States. The difference is that in Latin America, the reconciliation happened a lot quicker, and that the aftermath of the end of slavery wasn't followed by an era of racism and outright hate. And that is what distinctly marks the difference of Latin American slavery history versus Southern slavery history. See, here in the United States, once slavery came to an end, hate, racism, and discrimination continued to be part of the everyday fabric of life in the United States, while in Latin America, those sentiments dissolved fairly quickly. It's also noteworthy that the Spanish were not unchallenged in claiming Florida first. There were actually French settlements very early here, predating the English as well, and there were battles between the Spaniards and the French over who would legitimately hold power in Florida. While less historically mentioned, you can't forget that the French also had a very early and very legitimate claim to this coastline, only defeated by the Spanish. That doesn't mean that the French were not here before the English as well, and it really came down to the Spanish and the French luck of the draw situations in claiming this territory. There were many battles fought. Many times hurricane and weather played a role in determining who actually had the most legitimate first settlement claim to Florida. Because, in the United States, people in the Northeast, they actually believe that they had in Jamestown the first settlement in the United States. And while it might have been the first English settlement, it wasn't the first European settlement at most. Without a doubt, St. Augustine, Florida predates that considerably. In fact, before the English had their first Thanksgiving in the Northeast, the Spaniards already had grandchildren in Florida. Influences of the French can still be seen in the cuisine of the southeastern coastline of the United States. We can say that the English, the Spanish, and the French all in some way or another influenced what the cultures, architecture, and overall vibes are of the entire southeast coast of the United States. A coastline that over the centuries and decades has always seen new rivals show up, but battles take place over who gets to control it. A slap in the face to people in the Northeast who still somehow believe that Jamestown was the first establishment in the United States, ignoring history plainly that the state of Florida has the oldest establishment of settlement that is still existent in the United States till this day. If you've never visited St. Augustine, Florida, I definitely recommend it. I'm not going to be much of a tour guide on today's video. I really do encourage you to come firsthand and see this city for yourself and take the time to learn about Florida's history. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the history here has been kind of monopolized by capitalistic business endeavors. I mean, a lot of people are making money, and this is a good thing for the economy of St. Augustine, Florida. That is why today St. Johns County is analytically the safest county in Florida by homicide rates, and it has always been competing with Colonial County, Naples, for the #1 position in income. So you're talking about analytically, when it comes to incomes, the richest city in Florida, and when it comes to safety, the safest county as well. The battle for being the best county in Florida, St. John's representing St. Augustine, and Collier County representing Naples. The two most important analytics is income by county and of course the lowest homicide rates. And these two counties have been neck to neck disputing this for a long time. Now, being from Naples, Florida myself, I always felt that Naples, Florida was a richer and more elegant city than St. Augustine, but these two counties have been disputing for the best in Florida for a while. Now, keep in mind that when it comes to really what place is better to live, there really are only two analytics that matter: incomes and safety. And no other analytic is more important for safety than having the lowest homicide rate, meaning that St. Augustine, Florida and St. Johns County, where it sits, have been back-to-back disputing this title for a while. In recent years, analytically, St. Johns County has had the hand when it comes to these matters. But nonetheless, the police profiling law enforcement efforts in this area have not gone without criticizing. And frankly, Collier County, Florida has been practicing the same thing. Basically, the notion that it is okay to engage in police profiling if it contributes to the general well-being of safety in the county. Now, while in the state of Florida that may look like it's having results, you have to remember that when you compare it to other cities in the United States that have better safety analytics and better income analytics, places like San Jose, California, for example, they have stronger real estate markets, lower homicide rates, and higher incomes, proving that you don't exactly have to engage in police profiling to acquire better standard of living. But how can you compare the metrics of California to the state of Florida? After all, you are still in the South, and many of those ideologies still persist to this day, even visible in law enforcement. Recently, there's even been talks of a few counties here in this part of Florida joining forces and calling themselves Trump County. Now, from a more realistic perspective, some of these counties have some of the worst law enforcement agencies in Florida. While they do have good analytics, some of them, when you talk about law enforcement transparency, record keeping, and law enforcement practices, they definitely have some of the most questionable. For example, in this part of Northeast Florida, you guys know we pull body cam footage. Most of the law enforcement agencies that we deal with here are bad at transparency. The state statutes indicate that records have to be produced at cost of production to the public. However, when you request records from agencies in this part of the state, many times they want numbers into the hundreds. In other words, there's definitely somewhat of a racket going on with law enforcement here, where people are making big bucks when they're not supposed to, and basically law enforcement does whatever it wants in this part of the state. Unfortunately, this area continues to be more polarizing than ever, and the new changes that are coming to Florida seem to fall behind the notion of strengthening the already persistent issues of social inequalities in this area. So while for some people, St. Johns County may be the safest and best place to live in Florida, or people of other ethnic backgrounds, living here comes with other challenges. Almost every single time I come up here, I see some crazy road rage incidents. This person whacked my mirror. Now, I tried to just make nothing of it. After all, I didn't have any damage. But this area is also known for road rage, angry people. So it's exactly safe in one area, but when you actually look at day-to-day living, it sure is a problematic place. And it's good to see that some people still have a little bit of decency. And among the happy tourists, it also seems like there's a bunch of angry local people out here who can't stand the crowds, can't stand the people, can't stand the traffic, and feel like their town's been taken over by tourists. So it's kind of two sides to that as well. On one end, you have a thriving economy based off of tourism and the area's history. But on the other end, a lot of locals are upset at what this place has become. Basically a 24-hour tourist trap, which means that many of the locals feel that they can't enjoy their city because it's been overrun by tourists. And in fact, most of the growth and development here happens in the rural outskirts of St. Johns County, not so much near St. Augustine. So there's definitely two sides to that story. Well, that's St. Augustine for you, a tourist destination that I definitely recommend. And with how bad tourism in other parts of Florida is, it's good to know that there is still one place you can go to that has something to offer that isn't just a passing phase. After all, the history of St. Augustine, Florida is important to a lot of people for a lot of different reasons.